But the question here really is like, can he get up and walk around and heal and be the emperor he was back in the Great Crusade? It's very much on the edge of accepted thinking.
The Primarch reborn demands the impossible.
Hiya, welcome back to IGN. I am Arbitor Ian. I talk about Warhammer on the internet, and we are here today to attempt to explain some of Warhammer's greatest mysteries.
Unyielding against the darkness. We are the Emperor's angels.
Starting with a really big one. What was the deal that the Emperor made with the Dark Gods on Molech? This is a good place to start because it's arguably the biggest mystery in the whole of 40k. The Emperor of Mankind, way before he rose and formed the Imperium, before he created Primarchs or Space Marines, journeyed to a planet called Molech. This was pre-Imperium, in the days of generation ships and humanity spreading out into the cosmos. And on that planet, he found a portal into the warp where he went in and came out way more powerful. And he's known to have visited it again way later when he'd made the Primarchs and built the Space Marine Legions and started to unify humanity. And we also know that Horus went in there too when he was preparing to fight the Emperor, and he also got a massive power up, but we don't know if it's the same one. So, what happened? What did the Emperor actually do in there is up for debate. We know that the Emperor was a lot more powerful. He came out with something people call mastery of the warp, which could be a number of different things. Many demons in the setting, when complaining about this, will say that the Emperor did a deal or signed some sort of pact with the forces of chaos, with the forces of the warp, and then went back on that deal, tried to trick them and eliminate them from human society. That's how demons phrase it, but demons are often trying to get people to do what they want. They don't necessarily tell the truth, so we don't know if that's true. People on the Emperor's side talk about it. It's often spoken about as if the Emperor was stealing fire from the gods, like Prometheus in the Greek myths, that he went in and got something, not that he did a deal with them. So the mystery of what exactly the deal was, or if there was a deal, or what specifically he got, has never been resolved, and I think maybe might not ever be resolved because it's so central to kind of who was right back then. Big mystery, right? Hard to answer. What happened to the two missing Primarchs and their legions? Why won't the Imperium talk about it? And why is the truth never explained by the traitors who, I imagine don't really care what they're allowed to talk about? There were 20 legions of Space Marines created by the Emperor to go off onto the Great Crusade. And we know that by the time of the Horus Heresy, there were only 18 remaining. Only 18 Primarchs and only 18 legions. So 2 of them disappeared. And then way later, there was a Horus Heresy. After the Horus Heresy, the legions got split up into chapters of Space Marines, each 1,000 strong. So that's why there are so many chapters. But what happened to the 2 missing legions? It's one of those things that is littered throughout the lore, and you can piece together a few different stories. No one's completely sure. Obviously, it's something that was considered pretty bad at the time, because we still remember who sided with Horus and the Heresy, and we don't remember at all about the 2 missing Primarchs. The reason no one talks about it is pretty simple. When the 2 missing Primarchs were removed or killed or died or were lost, the other Primarchs had their memories erased or locked. And we see in some of the short stories that when they're briefly given those memories back, they then agree that, yeah, definitely shouldn't remember that. Very, very dangerous. Lock my mind again. So we can assume that the reason no one talks about it is because they physically can't. They all took some decision to not be able to remember it. And that's a really interesting reaction. One of the vague theories hinted at, one of them or both of them maybe, was involved in this massive war really early in the Imperium's history called the Rangdan Xenocides. As the Imperium was growing and just trying to establish itself in the galaxy, other alien empires were trying to do the same. One of them was this empire called the Rangda. And the Rangda are known to have employed brain-altering technology of some sort of mind control maybe. Again, they're only ever hinted at, but a lot of the names of their units or their weapons are called something like Cerebvor. And also there are redacted accounts that seem to imply that entire legions were lost in that war. So one theory is that the 2 lost Primarchs, one of them or both of them, were involved in that war, were maybe killed in that war, and that was considered very shameful or bad for morale or propaganda, and therefore it was never mentioned. Basically, they're a permanent mystery that no one's ever resolved, and the lore has been written so that it can't be, which creates, room for mystery within the galaxy. Outside the lore, of course, this is a great example of the sort of thing in 40k that is deliberately left vague, either to just create mystery in the setting, because real history has tons of plot holes and mysteries and things that we can't remember, or just to give the players more room to do what they want with their armies. The original 2 Lost Legions are a reference to the Lost Roman Legions. That's where they originally came from. They've never been filled in because I think it allows the players to invent their own answers to those questions. Where did Constantin Valdor go, and what's he up to? So, Constantin Valdor was the Captain General of the Legio Custodes during the Horus Heresy and the Great Crusade. He's arguably one of the first custodians ever created by the Emperor. He's kind of the Emperor's right-hand man. He's the main bodyguard of the Emperor, and he's a really, really high-ranking figure in the Imperial Court during the Great Crusade period and the Horus Heresy. After the siege, we don't see him anymore. He doesn't die. He finds the Emperor's body barely alive after his battle with Horus. He returns to the Emperor's palace, but then all records stop, and we don't know what's happened to him. On the other hand, way later in the 41st millennium, there are rumors that he is behind a thing called the City of Dust. It seems it's unresolved because this is a trilogy of books that haven't been finished, but in the Bequin trilogy, which itself is a sequel to the Ravenna trilogy, which itself is a sequel to the Eisenhorn trilogy, all written by Dan Abnett. It's a lot of books. In the Bequin trilogy, there is a mysterious city on a mysterious planet, which links to a sort of warp realm, we think, and the warp realm seems to maybe involve a character called Valdor. And that's all the information we have so far. Everyone's eagerly awaiting the 3rd book in the Bequin trilogy so that we can figure out if that's a red herring or if Constantin Valdor is actually going to be involved again. What is in the Dark Cells of Terra? So this is another one of those things that is spread across various parts of the lore. The Dark Cells are some very, very high security, also quite spooky prison cells, very, very deep beneath the Imperial Palace on Terra, which is Earth. And the Dark Cells are cells that were used to house ancient enemies that the Emperor found during the Great Crusade and maybe even before that. Like, these aren't necessarily physical things. They could be really weird apparitions or stuff that isn't really alive. They all have names like the Slithering Dreamer and the Eater of Gods. And these cells are guarded by a specific shield host of the Adeptus Custodes called the Shadow Keepers. Also, linking into one of the previous questions, one of the things listed as being in the Dark Cells is something called Subject 11. And one of those 2 lost Primarchs was the 11th one. So maybe there's a link there. Can the Emperor be resurrected? Interesting question, right? Because that presupposes he's dead. The Emperor fought Horus in the final battle of the Horus Heresy, aboard Horus's battle barge. He vanquished Horus, but he was mortally wounded and then returned to the Golden Throne under, I suppose, the Imperial Palace on Terra, from whence he does a few jobs. He maintains the Astronomicon. He holds shut a horrific warp portal under Terra. If he wasn't there to do that, then hordes of demons would pour through, which is very bad. And while doing that, and while being the focus for millennia of worship, he sort of ascended into being a bit of a warp entity able to maybe grant miracles. We're not 100% sure on who's doing that. Questionable first if the thing on the throne is considered to be alive or considered to be dead. Obviously the traitors to the Imperium would call him the Corpse Emperor because they think of him as being a corpse. But the question here really is like, can he get up and walk around and heal and be the emperor he was back in the Great Crusade? It's a mystery in the setting, like all these questions. In the setting, there are quite a lot of sects who believe in resurrectionism, particularly sects of inquisitors who base their beliefs around trying to engineer a series of events where the emperor's soul is like put back in his body or enough souls are sacrificed that the emperor can get back up and heal again. It's considered a loyal thing thing to believe for Inquisitors, but it's very much on the edge of accepted thinking within the Imperium, the idea that you should even begin to think that you know how to resurrect the Emperor. It's considered a very touchy belief to have. Linked into this whole conversation is also a thing called the Star Child. Just before the Emperor fought Horus, he's said to have taken a little part of him, all of his good bits, and cast them adrift into the warp, hidden, so that he would have the requisite mercilessness to fight against Horus. And the idea is that stuff might actually still be out there. That might even be the thing doing all the miracles. No one knows. What would happen if the Star Child, the Emperor's kind of nice soul, was recombined with the corpse that's sitting on the throne? No one really knows. Would that resurrect the Emperor? Outside the lore, it's extremely unlikely that anyone's going to get to the point in the story where the Emperor gets up. Not only would that ruin lots and lots of things that are needed in Terra, it also, you kind of end the setting that way. If the Emperor gets up and becomes a real god and starts walking around fixing things, 40k probably, I suppose it'd be grimdark in a slightly different way, but yeah, I can't see it actually happening, and that is reflected in the fact that in the lore, lots of people don't know how they would ever go around doing that. Why was the Terminus Decree assigned to the Grey Knights, and how would they achieve it? So the Terminus Decree is a sort of locked order held in the Grey Knights Fortress Monastery, which says basically, if the Emperor ever gets up, get him back on the throne as quickly as possible. Do not let that happen. For all the aforementioned reasons, like you'd have to end Warhammer. Every single Grey Knight is an extremely powerful psyker. They fight in a very specific way. They're very much tooled towards countering psychic threats, countering the forces of chaos and demons and things like that. And they're fabulously well equipped. They were also built as something of a failsafe to start with. They were established right at the end of the Horus Heresy, alongside the Inquisition, as a sort of way of watching over humanity's progress in the years to come. By that point, Malcador, one of the Emperor's closest confidants, and the Emperor himself both knew that they likely wouldn't be alive or functioning by the end of the Horus Heresy, so they needed to put in place some sort of backup plans, and the Grey Knights were one of them. I would imagine the reason they have been given this job, as opposed to giving it to the Custodians, who are much closer to the Emperor, is that the Custodians' job is to be bodyguards to the Emperor, and they would never turn on him. So if the Emperor got up and started walking around, the Custodians are never going to use force to put the Emperor back on the throne. It has to be somebody else. And the closest, most powerful thing in that situation is probably the Grey Knights, because they're specifically tooled up to deal with giant, powerful psykers. There's a load of questions in there, like, would the Grey Knights functionally be able to attack or defeat the Custodes? The Grey Knights have very advanced technology. The Custodes arguably have even more advanced technology. One-on-one, Custodians are meant to be a bit more powerful than a Space Marine, but does that count when it's a giant psychic Space Marine? It seems very unlikely that the Grey Knights chapter of 1000 Grey Knights would be able to achieve this, but they are still ordered to have a go anyway. What is the Legion of the Damned, and do they actually prove the Emperor is a god? So, there's a load of different bits and bobs of lore about this. The Legion of the Damned are a force of ghostly space marines covered in flame and armor who appear out of nothing to help beleaguered Imperial forces in their time of need. They're incredibly spooky, and no one knows where they come from or what they represent or what they are. In world, no one really knows about them. There's lots of theories by Inquisitors who witnessed it that it might be a symbol of the Emperor's divine will, like a holy vision or a miracle that has been granted. Also theories that maybe they're like the souls of dead space marines who kept on fighting even after death. Sometimes people have found banners from the Legion of the Damned saying, "For the Emperor beyond the point of death," and things like that on them. In world, no one really knows what they are, and there are a lot of theories about divine provenance. We have got one, presumably still canon, lore explanation for them, which is there a chapter called the Firehawks that were lost in the warp in a freak warp occurrence that meant that their bodies after that point just kept on degrading and degrading and degrading. They were unnaturally strong and tough and unnaturally spooky afterwards. And that they'd resolved that since they couldn't really have a proper command structure, and since they were evidently tainted by something, they would just continue to help out the Imperium as much as they could until they all inevitably succumbed. The Legion of the Damned are a really fun idea because there is a canon answer, but that canon answer doesn't completely make sense, so that leaves room for all the wrong assumptions in world to maybe be true. It's quite a fun one from a mystery perspective. What happened to the Brain Boyz? The orcs in 40k are of course an engineered species. They're weird engineered species who love fighting, created originally by the old ones long ago to fight a war for them. But the orcs don't really remember this. They have their own legends and they tell a different story. They tell a story of the Brain Boyz, who were the first orcs, and they were really, really clever. And the Brain Boyz needed some bigger guys to help them beat up their enemies. So they invented the orcs to protect them and fight for them. But the Brain Boyz were really little and weedy, and eventually there was a plague that affected all the Brain Boyz. They all died out, or maybe they all became really stupid and became the thing called snotlings, which are the smallest sort of orc. So in orc legends, the Brain Boyz are long gone. Isn't that terrible? However, we know that the orcs were originally devised as a species called the Krork, who were even bigger and more powerful, and considerably more clever. And they were devised to fight on behalf of the old ones, who are sort of incredibly powerful psychic magic space frogs from the ancient days. And that leaves us with a couple of possible explanations for this. On one hand, the legend might be true-ish. There was a thing called the Brain Boyz. They were little versions of orcs who were very, very clever. They were invented by the old ones maybe to regulate or rule over the rest of the orcs, and there was some reason why they all died out. That could have happened. Also, this whole story of some weedier orcs that the big orcs are meant to protect could just be the orcs' way of remembering what the old ones are. Little guys who needed bigger guys to protect them. Sticking on the old one theme, what are the Blackstone fortresses? Who made them and what are they for? So the Blackstone fortresses are massive space stations. There are a limited number of them around the galaxy, and they predate almost all of the intelligent species of the galaxy that are around in the 41st millennium. So people would find these things just floating in space and try and repurpose them. The closest we have to an explanation is from the Eldar, who call them the Talismans of Vol. Vol is an Eldar god. Of course, we don't actually know what Eldar gods really were, but they're not around anymore. And the best theory we have is that they were created by the old ones to help them in their war against the Necrontyr and the Catan. In the 41st millennium, they're used as weapons platforms, or as space stations, or as bases, or often they're just plundered for ancient technology. They're also made of a thing called noctilith, which is this black mineral, often called Blackstone, that can be polarized towards or against the energies of the warp. The Necrons make heavy use of Blackstone, but Blackstone fortresses arguably could be polarized either way. The forces of chaos famously got hold of a few Blackstone fortresses in the Gothic War, and then they used one to smash apart Cadia during the 13th Black Crusade. So they're incredibly powerful, ancient, mysterious space stations. Okay, what is the greatest threat to the galaxy? Is it Tyranids or Necrons? This is an interesting one, because do we mean the galaxy itself, or do we mean life in the galaxy? The Tyranids are a massive extragalactic bug swarm. They originated from a different galaxy, and they seem in the timeline of 40k to be slowly moving more and more towards our galaxy. All they exist to do is to consume planets, strip them of all life, and make it more Tyranids, and then move on to the next one. And by all accounts, they're in numbers that would be unstoppable by anyone in our galaxy. They're sort of a looming threat over every other faction, so we could argue that they are the biggest threat to life in the galaxy. Of course, the Tyranids are life, but once they've eaten all the biomass, they're going to move on to another one. On the other hand, the Necrons are a millions-of-year-old society with science so advanced it's like space magic, and we know that when they last had massive wars millions of years ago, some of their weapons could tear holes in, reshape, or really damage the fabric of reality itself. Also, a large amount of the Necrons are very much up for just wiping all life out of the galaxy as well. Many Necrons are waking up to find their programming's gone wrong and all they want to do is exterminate all life down to the smallest microbes. So, that's just as big a threat, right? So if pushed, I'd say that the Tyranids are probably a bigger threat to life in our galaxy, but the Necrons are probably a bigger threat to the functioning of the galaxy itself. There's also a weird bit where these two stories intertwine because there's some evidence that the Silent King, who is the ancient ruler of the Necrons, who's recently returned to the galaxy, has recently returned because he saw all these Tyranids coming and went, oh no, better go and wake everybody up. So, we might find out which one's the bigger threat when they inevitably meet each other at some point in the future story of 40K. Okay, what did Tzeentch learn from the Well of Eternity, and where did the well come from? This is a real mystery because it's only in a tiny bit of lore and everything else is kind of conjecture. So, Tzeentch is one of the big 4 chaos powers, the 4 chaos gods that live in the warp, and Tzeentch is the power of cunning and deceit and betrayal. Tzeentch has plans within plans within plans, and no one knows what the goal of any of those plans are. Now, the Well of Eternity is said to be a place in the warp near the center of reality or unreality, and it's the place where space and time started. And therefore, thought Tzeentch, if space and time started there, well, maybe if he threw one of his demons in, the demon could come out and tell him what's going to happen in the future. So he throws in a demon, and the demon comes out horribly bedraggled, but has these weird prophecies of what's about to happen in the future. That demon is a character called Fate Weaver. However, how much of that makes any sense is always a bit questionable when we're talking about the warp. The warp doesn't really have much in terms of time and space. So what it means by having somewhere where time and space started is a bit weird. And the gods are frequently also said to be beings that exist outside time, so why wouldn't Tzeentch know the future anyway? In truth, it's likely that this is an allegory, right? Something happened in the warp that means Tzeentch knows a bit about the future and is the origin story for Fate Weaver. But what happens in the warp is so unknowable to our fragile human minds that this is the story told to explain it. What the Well of Eternity actually is totally unknown. It might not be a well, it might not be where time and space started. What is the Alpha Legion up to in the 41st millennium? Is it an inside job, or are they really traitors? This is a deliberately comedic one, I think. So the Alpha Legion were one of the 9 legions of Space Marines that turned against the Emperor in the Horus Heresy, or did they? The Alpha Legion was specialists in subterfuge and covert operations, and they existed as lots of cells, all of which only had the information they needed to do their job. The Alpha Legion also made loads of use of mind wiping and subliminal programming so that their agents could be woken up and then given a code word, which means they'd take one or the other side in a conflict. And the whole point of the Alpha Legion is that the various different bits of it didn't know what the other various different bits of it were doing. During the Horus Heresy, the Alpha Legion may or may not have been on the side of Horus for real. They definitely fought on the side of Horus, but there's some evidence that at least some elements in the Alpha Legion were trying to, screw up Horus's plans from within, or trying to save wider humanity by stymieing what the Emperor was doing. What their original reason for going traitor was is questionable, but by the end of the heresy, a lot of their commanders were dead, and the remaining Alpha Legion were fractured into loads of warbands, and then those warbands have just carried on through the years. Some of them went into the Eye of Terror and became very chaosy Chaos Marines. Others kept on doing their last set of orders and covertly infiltrating the Imperium from within. And now, all those warbands may or may not be acting together or against each other. No one knows. The joke of the Alpha Legion is they're so secret that even they don't know what they're doing. So that's where they are by the 41st millennium. There's no evidence that the whole Alpha Legion are all working together or even have any sort of coherent plan. I think it's probably likely that some of them are definitely the very, very chaosy sort of traitor. Some of them are just against the Imperium and always have been, but for other reasons. And some of them are still following some crazy orders from 10,000 years ago, and none of them are able to piece that back together again. So there we go. The mysteries of 40K, not solved, but maybe given a bit of context. 40K is full of this sort of thing. We've only really scratched the surface of the level of mystery and unknown that exists within that universe. 30 years of novels and rule books and codexes all coming up up with plot threads will do that to a setting. Hopefully that's giving you an idea of the depth of some of these things. If you'd like to see me talk more about 40k, well, I've done a few more videos for IGN. You can find those. There are probably links below somewhere. And of course, there'll be a link to my channel where I talk about all these sorts of things for hours at a time. Thanks for watching.